Jack Calloway sat at his kitchen table, staring at his own obituary. The newspaper sat open before him, the ink slightly smudged from the coffee he had spilled when his hands started shaking. The words were clear, undeniable. John Jack Calloway, 74, veteran of the Vietnam War, passed away peacefully in his home. A small service will be held at St. Mark's Chapel on Sunday. He read it again and again. His name, his age, his service. He was dead. Except, of course, he wasn't. Jack let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head as he ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. A bureaucratic mix-up. The damn VA must have finally made a mistake too big to ignore. Maybe some clerk somewhere had hit the wrong button, or maybe some other Jack Calloway had passed. And now, here he was, buried alive on paper. At first, it was funny, until he realized no one had called, no one had checked. His phone had been silent, his door undisturbed. People had just accepted it. His laughter faded. He got up, crossed the room, and stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. His reflection looked back, wrinkled skin, tired blue eyes. A man who had outlived his best friends and his worst memories. He wasn't sure why, but something deep inside him needed to know. Who would show up to his funeral? Would anyone actually care? Jack arrived at St. Mark's Chapel 20 minutes before the service, sitting at the back, hidden beneath the brim of his old army cap. The turnout was smaller than he expected. A handful of people trickled in. Some he recognized, some he didn't. No one wept, no one looked devastated. The priest began reading from a prepared eulogy, something vague about honor and sacrifice, about duty and patriotism. It was generic, cold, impersonal. Jack wanted to laugh. He wasn't even sure this guy had ever met him. In the front row sat his cousin, Frank. The last time they had spoken was 12 years ago. His old neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who used to complain when he played his radio too loud, sat stiffly near the aisle. Some distant relatives, faces he barely recognized, whispered among themselves, checking their phones. His drinking buddies? Nowhere to be seen. No one from his old unit. No one from his old job. Jack sat there, stomach twisting. Had he really left so little of an impact? Had his life been so easily forgettable? Then someone unexpected stood up. A young man, mid-20s, stood near the back. Jack narrowed his eyes, trying to place him. The kid looked nervous, gripping his hands together before he finally spoke. I didn't really know Jack the way some of you did, he began, voice uncertain. But he changed my life. Jack stiffened. The kid swallowed hard. I was 16 when I met him. I was hanging out by the bus stop near the park, thinking about running away. My dad was an angry drunk, my mom had left, and I figured there was nothing left for me here. Jack suddenly remembered. A rainy afternoon. A teenage boy sitting on a bench, staring off at the horizon with empty eyes. Jack had sat next to him, offered him a cigarette, and told him, "Life doesn't stop just because you want it to." He hadn't thought much of it, but now, standing in front of the room, the young man smiled sadly. Jack told me I had a choice, that the world wasn't fair, but that didn't mean I had to let it beat me. He gave me money for a meal and told me to find something worth staying for. Jack felt his throat tighten. The kid took a shaky breath. I never got to tell him that I did, that I went back home, finished school, and now I work helping other kids who feel lost. And I wanted him to know that he mattered. He saved me. Jack swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of the pew. Someone else stood up, a waitress from the diner he used to eat at every morning. Jack always sat at the counter, she said, smiling softly. Always tipped more than he should have. One winter, when my car wouldn't start, he spent an hour in the freezing cold fixing it. I never got to thank him properly. Another voice, a young mother. He used to sit on the bench outside the grocery store. My son loved listening to his stories about being a soldier. He talked about honor, about courage, about never giving up. And because of him, my son is enlisting next year. Jack sat there, stunned. One after another, people shared stories about him. Things he had done, small moments he had barely thought twice about. And then he had spent years thinking his life had been nothing but a long, quiet march toward death. And yet, here they were. People he hadn't expected. People he had forgotten. People who had never forgotten him. Jack let out a shaky breath, staring at his hands. He had come here expecting to confirm something dark and painful. He had come expecting to see proof that his life had been a waste. But now he wasn't so sure. Jack could have left. He could have walked away and let them think he was gone. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to be invisible anymore. He stood up. Someone gasped. A chair scraped against the floor. And then, laughter. "You crazy old bastard," Frank muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "I should have known," Jack smirked. "What, you thought I'd go down that easy?" The priest looked pale, crossing himself as if he had just seen a ghost. The waitress covered her mouth, eyes wide. The young man from the bus stop stared, eyes glossy. Jack gave him a nod. Then to the entire room he said, "Sorry for the mix-up, folks, but it looks like I'm not done just yet." Some gasped, some laughed, some cried. Jack had spent years believing he was just a forgotten veteran, that he had no place left in this world. But looking around the room now, at the faces of the people he had touched, even in the smallest of ways, he realized something. He wasn't gone yet. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like something worth living for.